Victor was not the kind of man who drifted through life because his entire existence had been constructed around the opposite principle, around structure, repetition, precision, and the quiet certainty of materials that behave according to laws rather than emotion. And for 26 years, steel had been his language, his routine, his identity. He worked in heat and noise and sparks, welding shipping containers that would leave the yard and disappear into global systems he never needed to see again. Containers stacked on ships like ordered thoughts, moved across oceans like silent decisions, made physical, and every seam he created carried a continuity of control that made the world feel predictable until the moment it stopped being predictable at all. Not gradually, not with warning, but in a single collapse disguised as an accident, a wrong movement, a fraction of imbalance, a fall that lasted less than a second, but rewrote everything that came after it because pain does not arrive as information, but as total occupation, spreading through the body faster than language can describe it. And afterward, the hospital replaced the factory, sterile corridors replacing steel noise, white rooms replacing firelight, doctors speaking in reduced human terms as if life could be translated into manageable fragments, diagnosis, probability, limited recovery, incomplete restoration. And from that point forward, everything that had once supported him began to detach in layers that felt unreal while they were happening, yet irreversible in retrospect. His body stopped being an instrument and became an obstacle. Work stopped being routine and became impossibility. Home stopped being home before anyone said it out loud, because disappearance in relationships does not begin with departure, but with distance accumulating silently until presence becomes optional, until silence becomes heavier than speech, until two people occupy the same space but no longer inhabit the same reality. And then one day he left, not because there was a decision, but because the system that had held him simply no longer existed for him. And the tent near the railway became the nearest approximation of location in a world that had stopped offering stability, a place defined not by boundaries, but by exposure, where sound never stopped because trains replaced time itself, long mechanical passages that erased the idea of stillness, where cold was not seasonal but structural, embedded in the ground, in the air, in the fabric of daily survival, where people existed in parallel rather than together, each one compressed into their own narrow channel of endurance, avoiding recognition because recognition required energy they no longer had. And yet, even here, Victor did not lose the underlying architecture of perception that had formed his entire life, because a man who has spent decades understanding how things are made cannot stop seeing how things fail. And so when his eyes fell on the industrial yard and the rows of shipping containers, he did not see abandonment as others did. He saw geometry, containment, volume, potential, enclosed space waiting for reinterpretation. The same objects he had once built now returned to him in a reversed function, no longer product, but possibility. And that thought did not arrive as hope or emotion, but as mechanical inevitability, something that existed because it could exist. And once it existed, it refused to leave, becoming a constant internal direction rather than an idea. And so he began to observe, not impulsively, but structurally, returning day after day, measuring the place through attention rather than tools, learning its rhythm the way he once learned metal, when it is handled, when it is ignored, what is watched and what is forgotten, how systems create blind spots simply by being too large to maintain full awareness of themselves. And within that blindness, he located the specific absence he needed. A blue 40-foot container positioned slightly apart from the rest, its surface dulled by time, paint fading into uneven memory, rust forming like slow biological insistence along its edges, weeds growing around it as if the environment had already accepted its absence from relevance, and that acceptance was what made it usable, because invisibility in systems is not created by hiding, but by being no longer prioritized. And so he did not break into it, did not force a violent interruption into its state. Instead, he performed an act that existed somewhere between repair and replacement, removing the lock carefully, replacing it with one that maintained visual continuity, preserving the illusion that nothing had changed while completely altering internal reality. And inside there was only metal and absence at first, a hollow amplification chamber for heat and cold, a space that reacted to external conditions without resistance. And he understood immediately that survival would depend not on adaptation, but on transformation of the container itself. So every resource he obtained through fragmented labor was redirected into structural change, insulation layered like reconstruction of boundaries between body and environment, sealing not just gaps but vulnerabilities, building an interior logic that contradicted the hostility of the exterior shell until the container ceased to behave like industrial object and began to behave like enclosed system. And when electricity finally entered that system through hidden solar collection placed with deliberate invisibility, when the first light appeared inside not as illumination but as confirmation that energy could be sustained within a space that had previously rejected life, he did not react with joy but with stillness, as if verifying that physical laws had not changed in his absence from normal society. And water became the final threshold, because water is not infrastructure but definition of existence. And when he constructed a system from incompatible parts, improvised pressure, uncertain flow, repeated failure that collapsed into correction again and again until finally movement occurred, not as promise but as fact, he did not celebrate it. He stood under it as if standing under evidence rather than comfort, allowing the accumulation of months and years of invisibility to be carried away in physical motion. And only then did emotion appear not as expression, but as breakdown of containment. And after that, life inside the container became governed by rules, not because rules were comforting, but because rules replaced external structure that no longer existed. Movement only at night, absence during visibility, preservation of exterior abandonment while interior became increasingly human. Books accumulated like fragments of recovered identity. Photographs remained even when they hurt to look at, because erasing them would mean completing disappearance. And over 3 years, this dual existence stabilized into a pattern that was neither life nor death, but maintenance of presence under conditions that did not permit acknowledgement. And fear remained constant, not as event, but as background state, because systems that exist illegally always contain the expectation of correction. And one night, that expectation approached reality when footsteps entered the industrial silence with intention rather than randomness, light scanning surfaces, moving closer with deliberate investigation. And Victor did not think in narrative at that moment, but in immediate conditions: absence, stillness, non-interaction, reducing himself to minimum possible existence as the beam passed inches from the boundary, separating visibility from exposure, until it moved on and sound retreated, leaving only continuation of waiting. And when the final encounter arrived, it did not arrive as intrusion, but as exposure during daylight, when concealment becomes impossible by default. Doors opening, light flooding interior space, figures standing at threshold representing system reasserting attention. And he did not resist, because resistance requires alternative outcome, and none existed. And yet what followed did not match expectation, because systems do not always correct by removal. Sometimes they correct by integration, and the manager who entered did not see disorder but adaptation, not violation but unintended functionality, a living structure formed inside abandoned structure. And that recognition altered the trajectory of consequence, replacing removal with negotiation, replacing invisibility with conditional legitimacy, an agreement that transformed him from anomaly into function. And in that transformation, the container ceased to be a hidden rupture in reality and became instead a sanctioned boundary within it. And Victor, who had spent years disappearing in order to survive, found himself once again assigned a place not by accident or concealment, but by acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement, more than shelter or structure, was what returned shape to his existence, not restoration of the life